Thanks everyone for coming with our rescheduled event with the snow day and making time in your schedule to hear about what we're up to. So I'm going to talk about some of the things we've been doing, as Eric said, under the scaling inference mission and how platform and how it relates to several of the missions. And just to give you a sense of what are some of the exciting and different research bets that the Quest is able to make. What are some of the challenges facing us, and what are the roles of building new kinds of software infrastructure to let us address those? And those tools will be useful to people, I think, well outside the Quest, and already are starting to be useful. That also expands the people who are participating with us, both at MIT and beyond, and brings in new ideas, new energy, which is essential for such a grand ambition as we have. Okay. So Eric talked about the missions. And the missions have a number of different dimensions to them. But one way to think about what they're pointing towards are what we call North Stars, which means a North Star is key, is like a thing that you aim towards. It doesn't mean you get there, but it's how you know that you're heading in the right direction. And then we also have milestones and metrics to measure our progress in the direction pointed out there. So these are some of the example North Stars of the different missions, where we imagine having systems that present to people like what now we're used to seeing in AI that's everywhere. But inside what goes on is something that is a model of the human brain, whose mechanisms can be studied the way we studied the brain and the mind. That means with behavior and recording from its internals. And it represents our best model of the original intelligent supercomputer, the one that's inside each of our heads. We also imagine and are already starting to realize ways in which these systems models, as Eric said, both by advancing our understanding of how our brains work, can address many kinds of issues, including issues of mental health, for example, but also can lead the way towards new and much more robust and maybe more resource-efficient kinds of AI. So we might ask, what would it take to have a machine that can see everything in the world that a person can, but what goes on inside is a model of how the brain's perceptual systems work? Or what would it be like to have a machine that was like ChatGPT? It understands language, but inside it's a model of how your brain processes language and makes meaning out of it. And how do we do this in the era of AI, right? What does it mean to study natural intelligence when all around us, not just here at MIT, but in the entire world, we have systems like this, or like this, right? Or, you can't even do an internet search these days without engaging with AI. We have genuine forms of intelligence in machines. And what is effectively the bidirectional relationship between these remarkable advances and trying to understand what is really the source of everything ultimately in intelligence, which is the human mind and brain? Inside the Quest, we like to think about this as there's a big mountain or a mountain range, and the artificial intelligence and the natural intelligence routes represent something like two roads up the same mountain, two paths up the same mountain. They start from very different places and very different premises. They can help to bootstrap each other, and that's really essential to our progress. But we have to understand how that works, we have to understand their very different starting points. And in a sense, if you want to just take home one message from this slide, at least or from this talk, it's kind of this slide. Because what I'm trying to do here is lay out two different scaling routes, if you like. Scaling the Silicon Valley way, which has often been called the scaling thesis because it's about how intelligence grows with more data and more compute, the kinds of things that the tech world has figured out how to do, and it's the engine of all of its innovation and economic growth. And then the way intelligence is scaled in biology, or what we sometimes contrast this as like scaling up versus growing up. Every human mind starts with a brain that is a little bit smaller than your current brain, a lot younger, but the route by which we grow from starting as a baby, growing up into an adult, that is, in a sense, the original existence proof that it is possible to build a machine that grows into and learns to be intelligent the way a human is the existence proof that every one of us has followed in our own lives and that we see in our children. So what I'm laying out here on this slide is just the very big difference, right? And there's sort of three key points. In the machine learning, data-driven, compute-driven scaling route, intelligence is the end result of learning. Okay? The system starts out not knowing anything, and with very simple, dumb learning mechanism, gradient descent, just finding patterns in, let's say, text tokens if you're a language model. And then with enough training and enough data, something remarkable starts to emerge. But like any emergent phenomena that wasn't designed, it can surprise you, both in how well it works and when it doesn't work. Okay? Generalization, which is the key to intelligence, going beyond the training, is in these systems, again, sometimes amazing and sometimes fragile or jagged. These systems can surprise us where, like, for example, they can solve math Olympiad problems but not play tic-tac-toe. Some of the first reasoning systems, that was literally true. Or the latest reasoning systems in AI can get gold medals in the math Olympiad and yet get only 60% correct on a math contest for third graders. What's going on with that? Very weird and amazing and remarkable. And the way we understand it is because, like anything in machine learning, you have a distribution of where training data is, and you should expect generalization within the distribution, but outside the distribution, if it's just about machine learning patterns from data, then it's much more unreliable. Okay. And lastly is the relationship between language and thought, right? What has everybody in the entire world not just talking about, but using AI, is because, like in the way AI always presented itself in science fiction, you don't have to code these systems, you just talk to them. Okay. But the remarkable thing here, right, is that the intelligence comes from the way these systems find patterns in language, and they start off as models of language, predictive patterns in language, and then all the other kinds of thinking emerge. Whereas in the human scaling route, this is on the right here, the systems start off as intelligent from the start. That means, of course, like a baby, right? The system is our brains. Babies are not as intelligent, at least in many ways, as adults, right? But there's a basic kind of intelligence built in, and the learning mechanisms are also intelligent by design. That enables them to learn from a lot less data and more robustly. And the heart of that is that our brains from the beginning are built to be effectively what we call rational agents. That is, they have a model of the world and they're built to autonomously grow their models of the world. The property of having a world model is not an emergent property, it's what brains are designed to do. That's before language comes into the picture. But that means because we're model-based systems, and you'll see this theme throughout today, including some of the talks after lunch, because of that, our generalization depends on those models, not just the training data. And that is also the heart of how we can learn language so much more quickly and robustly. People often have remarked how amazing it is that a child learns language from somewhere between 10 and 100 million words, in contrast to the billions or even trillions of words that a large language model is trained on. So we have many orders of magnitude difference. How can a human learn language so much more quickly? It's because from the very beginning, you're mapping that language onto thinking structures that exist. And then language transforms those thinking structures. So to put some pictures on it, right, even much smaller brains with only 1 million neurons, like in a fly or a bee, or 100 million neurons compared to the hundreds of billions of neurons that we have, even in these much smaller brains, they are building models of the world, the physical world around them. And then something changes in humans, our ability to use tools in flexible, novel ways, to construct complex towers of Legos even in a 3-year-old. And then once you learn language and learn to read, to access knowledge that grows culturally across generations. So in the Quest, we have a roadmap for, as we like to call it again, growing into intelligence. That's scaling intelligence the human way, which starts out with some ideas that we turn into code in models that we write on our scaling inference platforms for what's built in and how do we learn the rest. So inbuilt cognitive architectures for modeling the physical world and the social world, motivations that aren't just to predict the next token, but and not just to gain reward from the outside world, but epistemic and social and even moral motivations. Babies are out there with a complex set of purposes in life. Okay. At the heart of this is this idea that you could put a simple word on it. You could call it rationality, right? If you're familiar with this, I know some of you are coming from economics, the business world. The idea of making expected utility maximizing bets effectively. That is, in a sense, the heart of what brains do. And they build models of the environment that allow them to understand the effects of actions as a function of the state, to assign utilities to those, and then to choose what to do the right thing, at least approximately. And the ability to do that with these basic world models, that's what brains are built to do. And then once you learn language, which you learn on top of these systems, that transforms your ability to build models of things that you couldn't otherwise do. So I want to talk to you about how, coming from cognitive science, computational cognitive science, and computational cognitive neuroscience, what does it look like to take the ideas that I've just shown you and put them into math and code, and to bring them to the test on human behavior and even brain measurements? I'm not going to talk in this talk about brain measurements. We'll see a little bit in one of the later talks, and a lot more in some of the afternoon talks. Okay. Here's a book that I and a number of colleagues came out with recently. It's sort of somewhere between a textbook and a research monograph, and thanks to MIT Press, you can read it for free if you follow that QR code. And it describes about 2 decades of research in what we call Bayesian models of cognition, which take that idea of rationality and show how you can make that work in a practical, pragmatic, what we sometimes call resource rational way, as an account of all the amazing things that human cognition does to build and use its world models. Just one other resource if you're interested and you want to learn. There's going to be a theme for the morning about probabilistic programming, and a very lightweight, easy introduction to some of the ideas is in this probmods.org webbook. So I want to refer you to those 2 sources. Okay? And what you can see in these sources is ways that computational cognitive scientists over, again, in some ways over 2 decades really, have slowly but progressively built the understanding in words and thoughts and code that lets us describe so many areas of human reasoning. So each of these just actually represent a fairly recent paper where the toolkit of Bayesian models of cognition and probabilistic programs have been used to not only describe, but to quantitatively predict how people will think in so many of these domains of higher level reasoning, concept learning, and so on. And to do that with math that's grounded in a basic set of principles, the ones we've talked about here. One of the key ideas, which again will be the theme of the scaling inference platform effort that you'll see here, is this idea of probabilistic programs and probabilistic programming languages. So these are ways of building models that allow us to connect and integrate good ideas from a number of different eras of AI, right? In the last few years, everybody's been talking about what's driven progress in AI as neural networks, end-to-end differentiable systems that, again, these are ways to really metabolize large data sets, parallel compute, and in the internet era. But the ideas that have built up over the decades since cognitive science, AI, neuroscience had their starts in the late 1950s include other good ideas. The idea of symbolic languages for knowledge representation and abstraction. And some of the original tools for probabilistic inference, like graphical models or Bayesian networks, which focused on this idea of making good guesses and bets. But each of these tools was not enough on its own, right? Symbolic languages originally in good old-fashioned AI were seen as too brittle, and reasonably were. Too rigid, too brittle for the real world. Probabilistic models, which really came to the fore in the 90s and the early 2000s, addressed some of that, but didn't have the necessary abstraction or the learnability at the time that came with neural networks. And now we have the ability to integrate all these ideas, and that's really been transformative. Okay. You'll see examples of that coming up. And now with the introduction of language models, which again, I think it's not an accident. It's really deep insight about the value of learning patterns in text that really are the traces, the cultural residues of all the thoughts that humans have built up over thousands of years and put into writing and then into digital form. Language is a real superpower for humans. And just finding patterns in text versions of language, if that also includes code and math and ways that can integrate with these probabilistic programming languages, is hugely powerful. So this idea that we've understood for a while in cognitive science, that language is a singularity and transforms world modeling and thinking, now, by using actually transformer-based language models, and especially the ones, not just patterns in language, but effectively the abilities to translate between informal natural language and formal symbolic code that can underlie these probabilistic program world models, that's really a superpower for us. So I'll just illustrate some of the ways that we've been using this toolkit, and what are some of the scaling challenges that have been that are honestly the challenge for us, but that we are now in a great position to address. So going back again more than 10 years, maybe 15 years, in our lab we started working on kinds of intuitive physics or physical scene understanding. Because again, this is where you can really see the brain's model of the world and its very flexible deployment, not just in humans, but in many other animals. So you can study it in neuroscience and you can study it in babies. And it's how we might look at scenes, for example, like these stacks of blocks, and instantly get a sense that some of these are stable and others might fall over. And if they fall, which way they might fall, for example. So you can ask a person to make a quick judgment from looking at one of these scenes. How stable is this tower on a scale of 1 to 7? Or just press a button, yes or no. You can get graded judgments like what are shown on the y-axis there, the vertical axis, are graded judgments from people about how stable any one of these stacks of blocks are, and we can model that. The quantitative model that you're seeing on the x-axis is the average of a small number of posterior predictive simulations. That's a fancy term, but basically what that means is taking the image, making an inference, a probabilistic inference about the world state likely to have given rise to the image. That's what we call inverse graphics, and you'll hear a lot more about that in a little bit. But this idea of saying, okay, there's actually a three-dimensional physical configuration of objects out there that is rendered into an image, and my first job is to guess what that block's configuration might be like. I'm not sure, but I make a guess. And then that same world state estimate is actually the state of what we call an intuitive physics engine. If you're familiar with physics engines in game engines or in graphics, it's the same kind of idea, but simpler and coarser in a lot of ways that we've come to understand. But it allows you to simulate on short time scales what will happen from the force-based interactions between objects if you run physics forward a few time steps. And you just make a few guesses and run those forward, and then you can inspect and see, well, how many blocks fell over in each of them. It's like a simple Monte Carlo estimate. I'll show you an example of that in a second on this other application. What's interesting about the case on the right here, the judgment is, I have these stacks of red and yellow blocks, and I say, well, suppose I bump the table hard enough to knock some of the blocks onto the floor. How likely is it, or how much likely is it to be red blocks versus yellow blocks? That's a weird question, which we just made up as an arbitrary question in an experiment to probe people out of distribution. The question of, how stable is the stack of blocks, anybody who's played Jenga, which is actually the majority of the world's population as far as I can tell, makes that thing, or anybody as a kid who's ever stacked up objects at all. But the point of these studies is that we can build with the very same modeling tool, we can build models which are quantitatively predictive of both very familiar judgments and kind of weird judgments because the model is the same. So to show you what this model looks like, here's an example of making one of these weird red and yellow judgments where we look at a scene, and then this is actually a view, you'll see it animated in a second, of a simulation inside a simple kinds of physics model, and then you simulate bumping the table. You saw that little bump, and you can see what happens. Here on the right is a simulation of a larger bump of the same scene. And I've paused them after a couple of frames to make the point that you don't need to run this simulation very long, and indeed, it's very difficult to do this in your head, and we don't think people do. But just running a few steps of a simulation under a few different guesses at the thing I didn't tell you, which is how hard the bump was, is still enough to get an idea that in this particular scene, almost all of the blocks that go off the table are going to be yellow and not red. So that hopefully gives you some idea of how this kind of thing might happen. And I like this example also because it was one of the first cases where we showed how using recent advances in language models and language to code models, we could now ground language in this system and really both scale up where we can do our intuitive physics and also understand much better what is really the meaning of language when we talk about a physical scene. So if you want more details on this, I'll point you to the paper From Word Models to World Models by Leo Wang, Gabe Grand, and Alex Lev. Alex is a recent MIT graduate, now a professor at Yale. Leo, recent graduate and postdoc at Stanford in their human AI thing. And Gabe is finishing up his PhD here. But the basic idea here is to take even a very simple language to code model and use it to translate from descriptions of worlds as well as questions you could ask into code in a probabilistic programming language and use that as the basis of this kind of rational world modeling, guessing, and betting and such. So here, this is work that those folks did together with Said Zhang as an early project. Said is another one of our PhD students. And here we took that red and yellow experiment and we basically just reconstructed it, not with images, but just with words. So we described scenes to people as well as to models. And then we used, in a pretty naive way in the first version of this, a language to code model to translate these statements about scenes of red and yellow blocks into lines of code in a probabilistic programming language. These express condition statements on distributions on possible worlds, which are generated by a probabilistic model of scenes. So an example of that, it went away here. Like this scene over here this is a view inside the internal simulator of the system, where now you sort of bump, like you can imagine exerting a force, that bump is shown, and simulating. First of all, you simulate what the scene is like to start off with, and then what might happen if the table is bumped. Here we can take the very same model now, we can give it a more complex scene description. It translates this into 3 lines of code, makes a more complex scene, and again runs a simulation and sees what happens. And you can turn this into a quantitatively predictive model of human judgments by just running a few steps of each of this pipeline. So a few different ways you might translate it into code, a few different ways that code might condition on a world model, and maybe even just one possible way of simulating that scene. And that gives you a similarly quantitatively predictive model of people's judgments. So just giving you a taste of what we're able to do by combining some old ideas and some new ideas. We can do the same kind of thing. I'm not going to go into the details as much, but you'll see more of this in the second talk after mine. But just to give one other example of core common sense reasoning where this idea has played out importantly, and maybe one of the most important areas for human intelligence, that again is something we're built from the very beginning as young babies and really grow as our intelligence grows, our ability to do what we call intuitive psychology, or sometimes called social cognition, or it's a big generalization of what you might have heard of theory of mind, but to use our mind to model not just the physical world, but a world where there are other minds modeling the world, and each of us modeling ourselves recursively. So we model other agents' world models and goals, so other people's beliefs and desires. And going back again, in some ways, definitely more than 10 years, maybe even 15 years, with some early students who worked in our group, as well as with Rebecca Sachs, who's another one of the Quest PIs in Brain and Cognitive Sciences. So people like Chris Baker, Julian Haar-Edinger. Julian is now a professor at Yale. Chris was one of the early AI startups that came out of our lab, actually in the first class of the Engine MIT Startup Incubator. Chris, with a couple of others, used the ideas that I'm showing you here to start a really interesting autonomous vehicle company, which is doing very well in a niche area that you haven't heard of because it's about infrastructure. But it was one of the earliest examples of taking these ideas out of the lab and putting them into practice. And in some ways, similar ideas are currently like in the much more familiar kinds of Waymo autonomous driving things that you're very aware of. But the basic idea that any robot who's going to interact, especially in a life and death situation with humans, goes back to what we have to do with our brains, which is to see somebody acting, to see the actions of an agent, and understand why they're doing what they're doing. We see an agent acting in the world, they change the state of the world, they change their own state, and we model what they're doing with this picture over here. They form beliefs based on what they see, they have goals, desires, and then there's a causal process inside their head of decision-making and planning, which produces their actions in a recursive loop. That, again, is kind of the basic model of a rational agent world model-based decision maker. And I put it up here not, in this case, or in this sense, as an account of what your brain is doing, although we do think at a high level it is what your brain is doing, but it's an account of how brains model brains, or minds model minds, in a sense. That's what we mean by social cognition and theory of mind. So we model other agents as effectively approximate rational decision makers, and we see their actions and we try to work backwards to figure out their probabilities and utilities effectively. So in some of the early work that this group did in what's become a kind of a classic experiment in this domain, what's called the food truck experiment, we see somebody like a hungry grad student on a campus much like ours who's going out for their lunch, as some of you might do in our lunch break. And you go out of the building, and you know there's some parking spots where various food trucks come to campus, but at least in this world, different trucks can park in different places on different days. But we know that there are 3 kinds of food trucks that come to this part of campus: Korean, Lebanese, and Mexican, indicated with KLM. And on this day, when our friend comes out of the building, they can see only one of the spots. They know there's another one on the other side, but they can't see what's there. But they can see the Korean truck is here, but they don't know what's on the other side. So watch what they do and make a judgment about what you think are their beliefs and their desires. They walk towards the corner of the building, past the Korean truck, around to the other side, where they can now see what's there, and then they turn around and go back to the Korean truck. So the question we ask people is, which is their favorite truck, Korean, Lebanese, or Mexican? What do you guys think? Yeah, Mexican. Interesting, because it's not even in the scene, right? It's not like, it's not as simple as just where did the person go or wind up, or where did they go towards, but you can represent that they are going towards something in their head. Because, again, you don't see it here. You had to follow the story that I told you. You had to form a mental model in your head of that person's mental model. And you explain why they were doing what they're doing, because you thought, well, maybe they really liked Mexican and were hoping it was there. We can also ask people what their initial belief was. So what truck did you think was there? Did you think it was Mexican, Lebanese, or could have been empty? On other days, it's empty. And people infer that probably they thought that Mexican was there, and they liked it. Otherwise, why would they have gone on that inefficient path? So this is just showing quantitatively people's ratings of those beliefs and desires, and that the model is able to capture it, the model that makes a probabilistic inference about what are the most likely utilities and probabilities that an agent would have that makes their actions explicable in this way. And the same model can explain many variations of these scenarios. So this is the kind of thing that we do in cognitive science. It inherits from the kind of psychophysics. You'll see this when you see the Intelligence Observatory and Brain Score. We do carefully designed experiments which vary parametrically little and big parts of scenes, and then we measure their quantitative effects on both people and our models. And these models can give really quite predictive. Again, this is the same kind of scatter plot I've showed you before. People's average judgments on the vertical axis, an average of model inferences on the x-axis. Quite predictive inferences about people's beliefs and desires. And you can also connect these to language models. I'm not going to go into that, but in some really cool work from Lance Ying and others, you can basically put a language front end on these things as well as a vision front end, and you can pretty much reconstruct the model fits of those original models using relatively simple, or some of the smaller, little bit more human-like language models, still quite larger than human data sets. But compared to like just using a base language model, like this earlier version of Gemini, which is pretty much at chance for these things, you can get very high correlations with people's judgments. And even some of the latest hard-thinking reasoning models are still much worse than these models where we take a relatively smaller language model and just use it to do the thing that we think your brain does with language, which is understand the story, but then exporting the reasoning to this intuitive psychology inverse planning engine. So I've shown you just a few examples of this bigger picture, a couple of key case studies that combine work that we started doing more than a decade ago with these probabilistic models and how language models can connect to this. And we want to ask, well, you could ask, how do we get to all these other things and everything beyond it? Because this is just a small fraction of the really unbounded set of kinds of problems that people can think about. And it's in the nature of human intelligence that we're always creating new problems for ourselves. So there really is no end to the problems that we can think about or make for ourselves. And what that leaves us with is what are the current challenges that are most important for our current platform efforts to address. So I want to talk about these challenges. So one is that in most of these models, inference is way too slow. Okay, that means like you build the model and then you run the probabilistic inference. I didn't tell you anything about how it works. I just showed you the results. But we have situations like in the perception cases for the physical scene understanding, things that would take you less than a second, maybe even a tenth of a second, might take like a minute traditionally for these inference algorithms to run, at least especially in the inverse part, to do the inverse graphics to reconstruct the scene. Or in these social scenarios, the way we wrote the code back in 10 years ago, in the work I showed you, a little story that might take you just a few seconds to think about might take, well, again, orders of magnitude more time to run. Like, maybe 5 minutes for one scene, but like, to do something that you could understand in 5 seconds, but to actually evaluate the models would be something you'd have to run for several days. Okay. Just as important, if not more important, is that building the models is too slow. So each of those models I showed you, which was a really cool milestone in computational models of human cognition, was like roughly one order one PhD student year. Okay, and that is too slow. If every domain that we want to model, it's going to take a really smart MIT student a year to model it. That's not going to get there, especially because it's in the nature of our minds that we can flexibly think about new situations just on the fly. So that's what we really need. And that's what we need if we want to have something like a system that's like ChatGPT but what goes on inside is like what your mind does. Because again, the remarkable thing about ChatGPT is, well, sometimes in the thinking mode, you have to wait for a few minutes. But like basically it thinks in real time. And that's a key part of what makes it useful as a product and what it's designed for technologically. And our brains are the same thing. Okay. So we need generality and efficiency. I'll come back to the top point in a moment, because that's going to really be the transition to the talks in the rest of the morning are going to be talking about our new probabilistic programming platforms that are really transformative there. But just a little bit here on how do we scale up the model building process. Well, here, this is building on what I've already shown you, which is really the remarkable abilities for code-based language models to address this issue. It's just an extension of what I showed you, where we took code LLMs and harnessed them in a pretty straightforward way with a little bit of probabilistic inference at each stage. Draw a couple of samples, refine, draw a couple more samples. But that basic idea can be extended to not just understanding how individual sentences in language are mapped into code in a probabilistic world model, but also how we might come up with models in a more open-ended sense in the first place. If any of you went to the AI and coding workshop back at the end of last week, you saw, and you don't have to go to that workshop to see, the remarkable transformations that have been going on in the world of software and programming, enabled by not just large language models, but agentic harnesses that allow you to, again, talk to your machine and have a software engineer inside. And again, we're again confronting the both remarkably impressive and somewhat jagged, weird things that these systems do. I'm not going to go into that here. I just want to say that basically some of the same kinds of ideas, but actually in small, more human-like scaled packages, can explain, or are starting to be at least a potential solution to how do our minds, in an open-ended way, build models of the world. So here I'm pointing to very recent work from Leo Wang, Katie Collins, Tyler Brooke-Wilson, and a large number of others. And again, this link will take you to an archive paper on this idea. But the basic idea here is to build what's called a model synthesis architecture. And this is really a class of systems in which this paper describes a very simple early prototype that, in the current world of agentic coding, we would say, in some sense, many ways of harnessing an AI coding agent with a probabilistic programming language in the loop are versions of implementing this idea. And that's what our current work is on, and I'll report more about that next time. But the basic idea is to say, in a model synthesis architecture, to use a code language model to propose, first in words and then increasingly refine it into code, a bespoke world model for whatever problem you need to think about. And then because that code is written in a probabilistic programming language, or is at least probabilistic code that lets you do rational simulation-based inference, then you do inference in the code to make your good guesses and bets. So as an example, here's just a sort of a sports domain. We described some sport that probably, I don't know if any of you have been in a canoe race, but you could be. And we describe, okay, some of the variables that might be relevant, but basically we say you're watching various teams of people racing canoes, and we want to make judgments about how strong various people are, or which teams are better or more likely to win, or who tried hard in which race. And the basic pipeline here is that this model synthesis architecture prototype does is it first takes the natural language description, describes the basic facts and questions in code, hasn't written the model yet, it's just described what kinds of things you're going to think about. Then it marshals up from its background knowledge, which is just whatever's stored associatively in the language model, in natural language, some of the kinds of factors that we might think would be relevant here. It articulates those into a dependency graph, so it says, okay, how do I think they might depend on each other? And then it turns that into code. Again, it makes a few guesses and it refines them a little bit. So it's not just a simple feed-forward pipeline. But there's a few steps, each probabilistic inference based on language code generation. And then at the end, what you get is a probabilistic program that lets you do the inference. And these inferences are actually quite good accounts of how people think. And this is maybe the most interesting thing for me as an experimental cognitive scientist, we started doing experiments that we never used to do before or thought trying to do, which is we let other people, like random people on the internet, crowdsource people, write our experiments for us, effectively. So we ask people, instead of just designing some carefully constructed stimuli, we can also ask people to come up with all sorts of other variables that, talk about whatever they want, variables that they think might affect the results of like a set of sports races, or your inference about how strong someone is. Like, somebody didn't sleep last night, they can barely stay awake, or someone else took an energy drink and they're really amped up, or someone came down with a stomach virus but they're still trying pretty hard, or whatever it is. So these are just real sentences that people wrote. And the model synthesis architecture is able to turn those into code too, in order to integrate them with the rest of the world model. So it's a scalable, at least in principle, again, this is just a small prototype, but what we're starting to see is something that can be a scalable approach to building models in the open world. And I don't have time to go into the details, but just quantitatively, it provides, again, a pretty good fit to the really hard problem of just how people reason about whatever somebody throws at them, and significantly better as an account of human judgments than just using the language model on its own. And that's really important, because if we think that there's actually the heart of the system is a world model in loop, then we need to understand that. Okay. Just in the last couple of minutes, I want to come back to this other challenge, because that's going to set the stage for the next two talks. And this is the kind of thing that, again, we couldn't just do as computational cognitive scientists or neuroscientists. It requires expertise from programming languages, which, as again many of you know, is a discipline of modern computing, very well represented here at MIT. And one of the most exciting things at the Quest, and more broadly in the world, is that the field of programming languages and systems based on programming languages and the field of cognitive science and cognitive AI are starting to interact in all sorts of incredible ways. And we're going to hear from a couple of our grad students who have been at the epicenter of that. But this is about trying to address the inner loop of inference. Because even if we could build all these probabilistic program world models, if inference was too slow, like, what good would it be? It wouldn't be easy to do research on. It wouldn't be a account of the brain. Okay, so we have to scale up by several orders of magnitude our inference. To illustrate the problem, like going back to the intuitive physics case here, right? Again, this is this old model that we built like 15 years ago. The hard part was the inverse graphics. So seeing an image of a tower like that over there, and then the system would get its probabilistic world estimate by a few samples. So look closely at what you see on the upper right. These are a small number of samples. You can see them kind of moving around a little bit. That's because we're running a kind of Markov chain Monte Carlo. We're running a stochastic, effectively a kind of stochastic search in the space of all block scenes. And this is what you get after that chain, that MCMC chain, has converged after hundreds of iterations. You get these samples of guesses of what the scene is. Here's another scene, and again, you can see a few samples. You see the blocks moving around a little bit. They don't move around very much, because you can make a pretty good guess, but those represent your posterior uncertainty about the blocks. Okay. But that's the sort of thing that might take like a minute or two to run, whereas you get that in under a second looking at the scene. Early probabilistic programming languages, this was work that was done in Vikash Mansingha's group and also mine by Tejas Kulkarni, again, like 10 years ago. We built some of the first probabilistic programming systems for inverse graphics, where they were very general. You could give them like a graphics model of a face. This is 10 years old or more, so it's pretty low tech. But like, for example, you see that image of a face on the left, and you're doing one of these MCMC chains, this stochastic search, and it starts off, again, watch it from the beginning. It starts off, It starts off not looking anything like that face, but after a little bit of time, converges to something that does look like that face. And it's not just matching the image, it's a full 3D model that you can use to imagine what that face would look like under different viewing conditions. Problem is, it's really slow. And at least at simple just matching the face, it didn't even work as well as a deep convolutional neural network. So no wonder nobody used it. This paper actually, it was a runner-up for a best paper prize at CVPR, the main computer vision conference. And people were like, yeah, this is really cool. I don't think this will ever work. No one will ever use this, but it's really cool. And similarly, we could apply, also from the same paper, the same system could do 3D body pose recognition by, again, a slow sequential probabilistic search to find something that fits the image, or generic shape recognition. Here we're finding these circularly symmetric vases, and again, you can see that trace of how inference changes over hundreds of iterations. But as one of the most influential, important, and very wise computer vision researchers said around this time, Jitendra Malik, one of the godfathers of computer vision, you know, when asked, actually in a talk here around that time at MIT, what have you learned about the brain that's relevant for computer vision? He said, well, the one thing I've learned is that it isn't just some big MCMC. Like, the idea of inverse graphics or analysis by synthesis is actually really appealing and allows generality and robustness, but it's way too slow. The brain is fast and parallel. This is slow and serial. And if there's one deep lesson from deep learning that's relevant not just for deep learning, but for what we're doing, it's this one, which is a good idea that seemed like a really good idea but was way too slow, like, for example, backpropagation in neural networks in the mid-'80s and early '90s. If you can get it to run 1,000 times faster on a GPU or any broadly available parallel compute, and with broadly accessible programming languages, it's a lot better. Okay, so it's at this point that I'm going to turn it over in just one second to our great young grad students who are both building a new generation of GPU-accelerated probabilistic programming languages that are also incredibly useful and usable by people who aren't just them, both because of the front-end expressiveness of these languages and also the ways language models and agentic coding are letting people use these systems even if you're not a programming expert. So where are we towards our North Stars? Well, they're still pretty far off. But what I've shown you is the toolkit, starting from ideas that we've understood for a while about how intelligence starts in brains and minds, the idea of making good guesses and bets, and ways in principle to put those into code with probabilistic programs, the right kinds of programs to capture the world models that are built into our brains, and now with language to code models for how those might extend with language. And what you'll see, we'll hear about GenJAX and Memo and applications of those in perception and social cognition, how we might actually get inference to work at the speed and scale that we have in brains. Okay, so I will turn it over to first McCoy Becker, who's the lead creator of GenJAX, and then we will hear from Eric Lee, who's been using these tools for 3D perception and part of the perception mission, and then Kartik Chandra, who will talk about Memo for social cognition. And how are we doing on time? Ish. Okay, cool.
How'd you get this set up? Did you?
You just extend desktop.
Extend display. Okay, great.
Extend display.
Awesome.
Does that look right to you?
Yep, I think so. Let's see. Great. Hi, everyone. My name is McCoy Becker, and I'm a PhD student here at MIT working within the Quest. I'll be discussing a probabilistic programming system which we've been building over the last few years to allow practitioners to build the types of world models and inference that Josh mentioned in his opening presentation. Now, this is a talk about programming languages and infrastructure, the language and compute layer for the ideas that Josh just discussed. So to start, I'd like to talk a bit about compute scaling in AI. Here's a dinosaur-themed history of how tensor frameworks like PyTorch, TensorFlow, or JAX came to dominate the landscape of machine learning research. You can tell I made this slide before Nano Banana became widely available. Now, automatic differentiation, the key automation involved in training neural networks, has a storied history which stretches back to long before JAX, TensorFlow, or PyTorch, the modern frameworks that every frontier lab now uses to train their models. The algorithms that would come to play a crucial role in the training of large neural networks were invented in the '80s, but there was a problem. The problem was that backpropagation, also called reverse mode automatic differentiation, for neural networks was difficult to scale on the hardware which was available at the time. While backpropagation can compute the changes that one needs to a neural network to make it better during training, the fundamental problem is that the architectures of CPUs are just not optimized for the type of data parallelism that occurs during training, with numerically intensive operations on large arrays. Computations like matrix multiplication, parallel reduction of large sums, mapping of a single kernel function over big vectors were not mapped well to the hardware. The journey to the present day started when deep learning pioneers made early heroic attempts to put the backpropagation computation onto parallel accelerators. In this paraphrased quote, for instance, LeCun remarks on the early speedups of backpropagation using GPUs before CUDA to be on order of 100x. And that's not a table stakes number. That's the difference between a month and a day for your architecture to train. Of course, this history leads up to the ImageNet moment in 2012. And after ImageNet, industry starts to recognize the potential value of the technology, and what we see is a large investment of capital, human labor, dedicated to realizing the potential of this technology. This, of course, includes massive amounts of optimization for hardware, novel hardware like TPUs, the high-level AD frameworks, TensorFlow, PyTorch, JAX, as well as compilers that could take the computations and transform them to run on GPUs and TPUs. Now, the takeaway message is that progress in AI techniques are often at the mercy of hardware. This is also true of probabilistic programming. And as Josh mentioned in his talk, we're beginning to ask similar types of architectural questions concerning parallelism for probabilistic programs, the program representations that we use to write structured world models as probability distributions. And in this talk, I'll show you a design and a system that takes some steps towards answering at least a part of this question. What about accelerating probabilistic programming? Now, probabilistic programming languages aim to support practitioners of modeling and inference. These systems provide automation to help users write down and work with probability distributions. One key operation in probabilistic modeling is conditioning a probability distribution on data, an operation fundamental to Bayesian inference, the model of reasoning that is commonly used in machine learning and reasoning under uncertainty. To support computing with conditional probability distributions, probabilistic programming languages provide two key capabilities. The first capability is the ability to describe joint probability distributions. These denote our structured world models, and they cover domains of analysis including 3D perception, goal inference, time series structure discovery, many of the examples that Josh showed in his talk. Probabilistic programming languages give programmers the ability to construct these models by providing them with expressive modeling languages that they can write programs in. Using these modeling languages, users can write down probability distributions as programs, and these programs can often make use of programmatic components like 3D renders, symbolic planners, or program interpreters as part of their definition. Now, the second key capability that PPLs provide is inference libraries and automation to support the programming of inference algorithms. These algorithms, these inference algorithms, are programs designed to compute or produce approximations to the conditional distributions induced on the modeling language programs written by the user when we condition those programs on data. And highly important, these algorithms are not just textbook MCMC. Textbook MCMC doesn't scale to the types of problems that we're trying to tackle. We often need to program or design the approximations that these algorithms produce with model-based specialization. The structure of the algorithm often depends on the model. Now, in this talk, I'll be presenting a system which starts to answer how we might vectorize the modeling and inference stack on the left-hand side for probabilistic programming languages with a type of inference called programmable inference, granting access to good performance and scaling via parallelization. In simple terms, the idea is to put this stuff on the left-hand side on GPU devices. Said more precisely, our concern is exploiting embarrassingly parallel subroutines in programmable inference. Now, programmable inference is a paradigm where users are allowed to customize their inference algorithms, often with degrees of freedom which themselves are programs. Take importance sampling as an example. Importance sampling is a type of approximate inference algorithm which involves a guess and check style pattern, where guesses from one distribution are used to approximate another typically intractable distribution. Here, the target, our imagined intractable distribution, is shown in orange on both sides. That's the thing that we're trying to approximate. The programmable inference part of this algorithm is a proposal distribution. You can see proposal.sample in the code snippets. This is a programmatic component which is sampled. This is our guesser. It's sampled to produce the guesses for our inference process. Now, the samples from this proposal are shown in blue. The samples are checked by being scored with a quantity called an importance weight. This is a density ratio, probability density ratio between the proposal distribution and our target distribution that we're trying to approximate. Now, in many probabilistic programming languages, importance sampling is written as a sequential program, shown on the left-hand side. Samples are drawn independently from the proposal and weighed in a for loop. But both the sampling process and the weighing process perform the same computation over and over again. If we could execute this process in parallel, like on the right-hand side, we could produce many samples simultaneously and then weigh them all at the same time. On modern GPU devices, this drastically improves the scaling of this process as the number of samples increases, which is a useful way to improve the approximation quality of your algorithm. Just take more guesses. So our design, our system design, allows users to do that and take advantage of other opportunities for parallelism in programmable inference. And the way this works is that we expose automation for something called vectorization. So this automation takes the form of a user-facing construct in a programming language. This user-facing construct is called VMAP. Those of you who are familiar with the JAX machine learning framework will be familiar with this. It's a program transformation for vectorization, which in our design, we make sure composes with all of our probabilistic stuff, all the probabilistic automation. That includes all the automation that we use to write our inference algorithms. Now, vectorization in this context means transforming computations over scalar data to operate on higher ranked arrays. In particular, VMAP stands for vectorizing map, applying a function over some axis of array arguments. In our system design, this VMAP transformation, this vectorization transformation, can be applied anywhere in probabilistic programming code. It can be applied within models, can be applied within inference, anywhere that the user desires. So I'm going to give some intuition for how our system works in a quick tutorial on the next few slides. I'll note quickly that we just published a paper about the system to POPL this year. Our paper is now up on ACM. The QR code top right will take you to the paper. I'm going to defer many of the low-level details of the system to a read of the paper, and instead I hope to give you some intuition for the elements of our system at a higher level. So now I'll break down how it feels to use our system. Here's what a model looks like in our system, a world model. It's a program with special syntax. Now, the compiler of our system works by exposing a DSL in Python to users, which allows them to write our system's probabilistic program type, a type called generative functions, as programs using our syntax. Now, a few things to note about the syntax. The @gen decoration above the function, say on line 2 and line 10, denotes that this object is a generative function, our type of probabilistic program. Within one of these generative function programs, users can introduce random choices by invoking distributions, like on lines 4 through 6, invoking the normal distribution. You can even invoke other generative functions using the addressing @ notation. So that's shown on lines 4 through 6 and also on lines 12 and 14. Here, for instance, in polynomial, we define a model over the coefficients of polynomial curves using normal distributions. Each coefficient is drawn from a standard normal. The design of generative functions, this program type, is compositional. We can use the polynomial program inside of another generative function, point, below, to define a distribution over curves and point data, right? So the syntax may look complicated. But here's what a sample from such a program looks like. No surprise, it's a curve and a point. And there's also a log density there as well. That's what log p means. Now, I'll talk a bit about how we get and work with these samples as well as other probabilistic information in our system. So how do we do useful things with these generative function objects? Well, our design gives users access to interfaces for probabilistic computation. These interfaces cover concerns like sampling, probabilistic density evaluation, updating of a sample, the basic ingredients, these operations that are the basic ingredients you need to write algorithms like importance sampling, MCMC, sequential Monte Carlo, and other algorithms that I won't mention now. The interface provides, this interface called the generative function interface, provides a layer of separation between model and inference. You can write an algorithm using the interface, and it will work generically with generative functions. One can apply these interfaces to generative functions to construct probabilistic computations. One can then use these interfaces to implement inference algorithms. Take importance sampling again. This is our guess and check style pattern that we saw in our animation. Inference algorithms often involve logic that requires sampling from one generative function and density evaluation for another. That was our guess and check pattern, remember. Here, in this implementation, we sample from the proposal using simulate, which gives us an object called a trace, which I'll talk more about in a moment. A trace is a structured sample type, represents samples from our probabilistic programs. We then take that trace and use it to evaluate the density of the model using the assess interface. And this allows us to compute the importance weight, the thing that we're scoring samples with in this algorithm. And remember, this is just the guess and check pattern for approximating the distribution of model that we saw earlier in the talk. Now, let's dig in a bit more into one of the interfaces. Let's get some intuition for simulate. Simulate samples a trace from the distribution, which the generative function denotes, and computes the evaluation of the density function at the sampled trace. Now, traces in our system are tree structure data with addresses and the values of samples along with the density evaluation. You can sort of read the structure of a trace off from the program. You see how the addresses structure, the addresses on the right-hand side structure the tree on the left-hand side. The result of applying our simulate interface is, simulate to our point generative function bottom right is the trace structured on the left-hand side. And again, in our point model, a trace is just a curve in a single point sample. That's all that a trace is representing. Okay. So that's how our that's an example digging into one of our probabilistic interfaces. How do they actually work in our compiler? Well, they're program transformations. Our compiler takes the source code of the generative function and constructs a transform representation that accumulates the samples and density values required to implement the semantics of that interface. You can see our paper for a detailed description of this, but on the right-hand side, I'm showing the first-order representation that our compiler works with to perform these transformations. The same structure is true of all the other interfaces. Now, the natural question is, how does vectorization using VMAP work in this system? So we talked about our probabilistic interfaces. What about vectorization? Well, vectorization also works as a program transformation. It's a program transformation that preserves the structure of that tree-structured trace data that I showed you a few slides ago. It takes the program which generated this trace to one which looks identical, but with some of the primitive operations transformed to work on higher rank arguments. This is exposed to the user, so they get to decide how they vectorize over what, et cetera. Now, the real work of vectorization is done at the primitives of our language, the sampling primitives, the array computation primitives, et cetera. All primitives in the language have built-in vectorized versions, so each primitive has a rule for how vectorization transforms it to operate on higher ranked values. Practically, this means that under VMAP, computations which produce traces create the same address structure. So you just get, if you vectorize, you get traces out. The only thing that's changed is the leaf values have been broadcast to higher ranks. So if you simulate from the vectorized probabilistic program, say we apply VMAP to the thing I showed you before, you get a trace which represents this type of data, a curve in multiple points. This starts to look like a distribution that you could use to do regression. The trace, which includes the random choices and addresses, looks like the right-hand side. Note here that OBS, which before contained a single scalar point, now includes 5 draws for each point. Because our vectorization transformation is structure preserving on that object, you can just nest vectorization automatically. So you can apply it multiple times, and each time you apply it, what you get back is a higher rank computation on probabilistic structure. Now, by using VMAP, you can take inference processes that you write using the probabilistic interfaces and transform them into vectorized variants with essentially a single line of code. So on the left-hand side here, I'm showing the importance sampling algorithm that we talked through a couple slides back. On the right-hand side, on lines 13 through 16, we're free to apply VMAP to the single particle version on the left-hand side. What you get out is a multiple particle version using vectorization. So it's very easy to construct multi-particle versions of algorithms. Now, the payoff of vectorization, why go through all this pain? The payoff is utilization of parallel hardware to scale these algorithms and programs. For instance, we might use the polynomial curve model to infer curves given data, shown on the bottom. This is a polynomial regression. Using our system gives the user access to GPU execution. The scaling of the algorithm becomes close to constant until GPU memory is saturated. In the top left figure, we're showing the scaling as we increase the number of guesses in importance sampling. And in the top right figure, we're showing a probabilistic estimate for the log marginal likelihood of the data, which is informally gives some intuition for goodness of the approximation. Within this language, we're free to scale inference programs in embarrassingly parallel directions. Next, I'll show some of the results from our system, which are included in our paper. I'll go through this a bit quickly because I'm short on time. One interesting experiment we did, we used our system to approximately invert Conway's game of life, which is a cellular automaton system where the pixels in an image can be on or off, and there's transition rules which determine what the next state of the system is. The transition rules for a pixel in the image only depend on the neighborhood around the pixel. Now, it's hard to invert this game. It's a massive discrete search problem. But if you add a bit of probability, you can write this game as a probabilistic program in GenJAX, and then you can find approximate inverses for life state. So if you look on the observed state right there, you want to find what's the state preceding this state, which leads to the state under the transition rules. Using an inference algorithm called Gibbs sampling, we can find high-quality approximate inverses in milliseconds on a consumer-grade GPU. Another example that I think I'll talk through quickly, we also did some experiments studying robot localization in 2 dimensions, exploring an algorithm class called sequential Monte Carlo. We found similar scaling speedups when using our system for that. We're able to find good high-quality algorithms that we can run in milliseconds to track a robot in 2 dimensions. Now, those examples that I just talked through are examples you'll find in the paper. Our collaborators have pushed the system much farther, exploring probabilistic program design for 3D perception and modeling of physical matter. One former student, a PhD student had since graduated from MIT named Nishad Gathaskar, used GenJAX to implement several modeling and inference processes designed to construct representations of physical scenes. Here you're seeing a system called Bayes 3D, a system which uses approximate inference to infer the structure of a 3D scene, including the position, placement, as well as mesh representation of objects in the scene. In addition, Nishad and another student, George Mateos, with other collaborators, continued to work using GenJAX on matter representations, and were able to construct a 3D matter model based on hierarchical Gaussian mixture models with fast parallel inference. This architecture is able to run at close to real time, and they've moved on to work at a company exploring the implications of the ideas they developed. Next, you'll also hear from Eric Lee, who has pursued ideas in a similar line of thinking for articulated matter in a system called GenMatter, which will be a great talk. So finally, just to briefly summarize, we've discussed GenJAX, a new system which takes steps towards bringing probabilistic programs to GPUs. In a bit, you'll also hear from Kartik Chandra, who will discuss another GPU-accelerated PPL design for theory of mind modeling and cognitive science, which has been tremendously successful. This slide just shows the contributions from our paper, which you can find online using the QR code top right. Thank you for your time. This code provides a link to our implementation in Poplar Artifact. Thank you.
So why don't we let Eric talk, which is going to follow directly on from that, the latest ways of using this for perception. Then maybe if people have a question or two while Kartik is setting up, we can have questions for those folks, or we can just save questions for the end or find people even during the lunch break. Okay. So take it away, Eric.
So, hi everyone, I'm Eric. I'm a 4th-year PhD student, also in Josh's group, and today I'll be talking about how to perceive physical objects with generative matter models. So these are models where that see in a human-like way and represent moving matter in a scene in accordance with kind of perceptual grouping principles and these Gestalt things that you might recognize from classic psychology. So why do we care about this kind of perceptual intelligence mission as part of the quest? Well, we care about these coherent world models so that in any environment and situation we see, we can predict and act. Human 3D scene perception is fundamentally probabilistic in nature, and there are these nice robustness properties. Our vision maintains probability distributions over scene interpretations rather than committing to a single explanation, and because of this, it can gracefully handle noise, occlusion, and ambiguity. And even when these inputs are degraded, like you see on the left, where we have this giraffe-like figure moving, even though the texture itself is this just stochastic dot motion, or in the middle here you have driving in the rain, where you have these windshield wipers that temporarily occlude the scene, and you have this rain that kind of effectively blurs out the scene. Or on the right here, you have this example of a football helmet, where there's an intense amount of ego motion, and these the lights in the stadium also kind of disrupt your field of view. Even in these settings, human vision and biological vision is remarkably general, and even when we're given signals like this, we can still make out a 3D scene structure. We also care because perception tends to be rational. Our perception approximates Bayesian inference, combining what we see with what we know. And this means that even when there are a lot of compute limitations, we can make a good guess given this limited information, and we can update these guesses as new data from the world comes in. So why does probabilistic inference enable robustness in biological vision? Well, if you kind of feed in a 3D, an RGB video into a vision system, there are a lot of kind of mid-level features that you can extract. One thing being scene motion. So of all the things that are in the scene, which ones of them move and which ones of them don't? There's also a 2.5D sketch you can build of a scene. So if I just give you a single static 2D frame, you can actually build out a 2.5D, so a depth map showing of the things in the scene, which one are closer to you as a viewer and which ones are farther away. And also, there are appearance-based features. These are the colors and textures in the scene give you a lot of information about what's present in the world. And what our perception system does is that it groups together these three kind of disparate sources of information into one coherent and static and updating 3D scene representation of the world, where as things move around in the world or as things change, we can keep the relevant information in register to do any downstream task. So the idea I'd like to present today is of grouping as inverse optical flow. So optical flow in computer vision is this idea that if I give you an RGB image and this RGB image comes as part of an RGB video, each pixel has an associated motion. So this pixel level optical flow is caused by deformable objects moving in a scene. And then if I locally cluster this optical flow and texture, we get these small bits of matter. And clustering these small bits of matter gives coherently moving physical objects, right? So this is kind of a feed-forward process. If I give you the flow, you can group the flow into these kind of particles, and grouping together the particles gives moving objects in this scene. So a cartoon of a structured generative model, right, would be, what if how would I get a 3D scene where there are pixels with color and motion? Well, first I would want to pick the objects in the scene, and then given each object's 3D pose, we pick the particles making up the object. And then for each particle, we would want to compute the pixel-dense flow vectors to get the particle motion back out. And you'll notice that this is, the black arrow is kind of the forward generative process, and the white arrow is the Bayesian inverse. So one way we can kind of choose what the objects are, choose how to represent the objects with particles, and then get out the actual RGB scene with motion. And then the other way is if I give you the RGB scene and motion, you can get out the particles and then get out the moving objects. So a little bit more formally, since McCoy has kind of laid out this nice GenJack system that you can write probabilistic programs with, we can write down our model as this hierarchical mixture model of particle motion, position, and object groupings. So at the first layer, on the right here, I have this kind of model as an algorithmic description where we have these green clusters, and these clusters themselves have kind of these spatial Gaussian properties. They have covariances and means. And these clusters move in the world, so they have translations and rotations. And each one of the particles themselves also has position in space, right, because it represents some kind of moving 3D matter. And the motion of the particle is determined by the rotation and translation of its parent cluster. And because these clusters need to kind of define objects that aren't just ellipsoids, we can associate multiple particles with each cluster, and sampling data points from each particle gives us the actual moving point cloud that we see in the world. Showing how we can run the system on an RGB video input, we have on the left here video frame. I'll show some video examples later, but here are some static examples. If I take this deformable cloth, so this is actually me, we have a jacket here that's on a table, and we're shaking the jacket. And as the jacket shakes, the inferred 3D matter particles, when colored by the actual color corresponding to the texture, they track the scene, the little bits of matter in the scene well. And also, we note that when we look at the inferred 3D matter particles colored by the cluster assignments, so this is kind of, you can think of this as something semantic. Even as the video evolves through time, the semantic labels of each of the clusters remains associated with the correct semantic interpretation. And on the right here, we have a similar behavior with Jello, where this is also a highly deformable object that kind of collides with something static. And even when this happens, we see that the kind of 3D scene interpretation, even though the world is moving, remains a valid interpretation under this new data. So how can we actually do this in practice? Well, as kind of Josh was getting at earlier, a lot of this traditional inverse graphics work is very slow. This model that I've laid out has a lot of parameters at many, many different hierarchical levels, right? There are these high-level parameters corresponding to a kind of objectness. There are these mid-level parameters corresponding to groups of small matter chunks, and then we have the lowest level of data corresponding to appearance features and points and their motion. We have to use real-time. We can actually do real-time inference using the GenJax programming system that McCoy introduced. And on a single NVIDIA GPU, if we kind of cleverly exploit the conditional independence model, so if I give you the information at each layer in the model, it kind of nicely lets us parallelize the updates at the other layers of the model. And also, we can use just-in-time compilation that using this JAX programming system gives us in order to kind of batch the matrix multiplications and the inversions. And the result is at 260 by 480, which is enough to be representative of the full resolution scene, we can run at 10 FPS. So this is getting close to the 100 millisecond number that Josh was mentioning earlier. And we can even subsample this video further, and we can run even faster with minimal accuracy loss. So the full kind of pipeline of the system looks like we input an RGB video, we extract features that are optionally depth, but also flow, which gives us the motion grouping. And also we can extract some appearance features that tell us per pixel what is the information that you would get from the texture and the texture alone. We can initialize this, a 3D scene representation with some initial clustering, and then we feed this into a Bayesian filtering engine. So this basically is an online tracking loop that also is made possible by GenJAX and the vectorization. So McCoy, when he was talking about vectorization, we can achieve this kind of program level vectorization in time by kind of precompiling this tracking loop and running it across the whole video online in a sequential fashion. So GenMatter also, we would like it to be a computational account of shape from motion. So here I'm showing these kind of Gestalt grouping principle stimuli that have, the difficult examples here actually have very little information, and it's very difficult for modern computer vision systems to get out a good percept here. A lot of these, you might see that these Gestalt stimuli resemble camouflage. So if I give you any particular frame, it's very difficult to see what's going on in the scene. But as soon as there's motion in the actual object in the scene, the object just immediately pops out. So how do we capture this kind of behavior that biological vision kind of gives us, right? So even in these stimuli where texture alone doesn't really give us any cues for what's in the scene, when there's a little bit of motion, as long as there's kind of consistency in the video, we can get out the segmentation, the depth, and the surface. And psychophysical studies show that humans can effortlessly do this task. When we show these to people, I'm sure you can see as on the slide, humans are basically at 90% plus accuracy. They have no trouble interpreting any of these scenes. We're also interested in studying these stimuli in both brains and in kind of how biological brains can disentangle the motion and the shape parts of these stimuli. So in work with Yoon Kim and Thomas O'Connell, they've been recording multiple parts of a macaque brain. The ventral stream, the top area, traditionally understood to be part of object recognition and shape processing, and the dorsal area, so this is the bottom, traditionally associated with motion in space. They found that these stimuli actually can induce responses in neurons in both parts of these brain that are traditionally understood as separate pathways, but the shape from motion stimuli causes signals present in both. And we want to compare this to state-of-the-art computer vision, which also advertises to be robust and human-like, and with this full generality of being able to factor out shape from appearance. One more thing is when we actually do so compared to deep nets, when you actually look at the dorsal and ventral stream recordings, state-of-the-art autoregressive video models are now kind of leading models of this behavior. They can align to neurons pretty well. So actually tasks where getting the shape is easy, also we can actually correlate with the neuronal responses pretty well. But yet there's still this performance gap where even the best kind of autoregressive video models, they have trouble achieving human-level accuracy at the actual kind of 3D shape inference tasks. So not just explaining the 3D, not just explaining the neural recordings, but actually explaining the human behavior. But we also see that GenMatter, it supports these structure for motion inferences. So I'm showing you examples of super complicated scenes where the texture actually is very hard to interpret. But we see that when we feed these into GenMatter, the segmentation map immediately lights up. And I'd like you to focus on the bottom right here, where I have an example showing exactly how this fails for competing deep learning-based computer vision approaches. So here there's kind of a zebra, seahorse-looking thing, and it kind of rotates on its z-axis. The scene is hard for standard computer vision because if you actually just go in and you compute the flow estimate, so this is the figure that's lit up in blue and red here, the fact that there's on-axis motion, it actually means that The top half of the scene, it moves one way, and the bottom half of the scene, it moves the other way, right? So because the red and blue, they correspond to different channels that encode different positions of movement. And on the very right here, actually, when we feed these videos into a video depth estimator, so these are models that can kind of use cross-view information to kind of solve for the 3D structure. Actually, these videos are too difficult for the depth estimator to be able to do anything. But yet, if you kind of are able to integrate this 3D information, you can actually form one 3D shape percept in a way that kind of this, in the middle here, FlowSam is a model that has been fine-tuned from just optical flow, and it's been supervised with kind of moving 3D objects. Even then, even when fed in this clean flow signal that clearly tells that there must be on-axis motion because part of the scene goes right and part of the scene goes left, the segmentation, it doesn't do as well. So we can beat these learned video segmentation baselines. SegAnyMo and FlowSam here are both deep nets, and we're both more accurate, and we have less variance. And we also see that on the these Gestalt stimuli, these textures are actually graded by difficulty. So on these easy textures, all of the models tend to do well, and on these difficult textures, all of the models tend to kind of struggle. On the easier textures, actually, it's immediate that if I just show you one frame, a lot of people are able to see the outline of a 3D shape. But this is much more difficult on the difficult texture where kind of you don't even see the outline, and the fact that these black dots are very sparse makes it difficult to kind of match these features across frames. Finally, we did an experiment comparing our model on tracking from RGB video. So here we're comparing against systems that do point tracking in 2D scenes. And in these systems, on the first frame, you kind of initialize a dense grid of dots. And the goal here is as the latent 3D world moves, you want to kind of track these dots across time. And we can interpret the particles that our system generates as equivalent to these dots. And the experiment here is if you kind of initialize the scene with dots, and you give each one of these dots a semantic label, right? So I tell you on the first frame, or you can kind of use a segmenter that some of these dots correspond to a camel and the other ones correspond to the background. As the video moves, how many of these dots stick on the camel and how many of these dots stick on the background. And coloring these, each pixel with its associated particle, right? So this is equivalent to the dots that deep learning systems like CoTracker use. We see that even across videos, when we run GenMatter as kind of a clustering and a filtering system, the 3D scene interpretation is stable. So the outline of this bird here is preserved, and the kind of particles that all correspond to this kind of distributed representation of a bird, they remain stable even as the bird itself moves. And also on this difficult elephant task, where this elephant gets partially occluded by these wires, and there's dust, and there's a little bit of camera shaking. And on the bottom here, where even when we have this goat that kind of naturally camouflages against its background, and there are all of these rocks that present some occlusion challenges, even then, kind of the segmentation remains stable across as the scene moves, and the particles in the scene also are a consistent 3D representation. Quantitatively, when we compare against CoTracker 3, the latest deep learning system, we do about as well with much lower variance. So Davis has a lot of kind of challenging videos where there's a lot of occlusion, and there's dust, and there's wires, and there are all sorts of kind of things in the natural world that you would expect to kind of occasionally struggle with. And we're about as accurate, but the key is we're more consistent. And also, because we're a probabilistic inference system, we can make this compute accuracy trade-off where what I'm showing you is the full resolution video, but you can totally downsample this video and get more performance with minimal loss in accuracy, because actually you see this behavior where subsampling the data, it actually is equivalent to kind of this probabilistic coarsening, right? It's kind of equivalent to blurring the whole scene with kind of a Gaussian filter. And when you do that, you actually you get a little bit more robustness, because you don't have to explain your data perfectly. You just have to explain it well enough that no other explanation kind of is in the same ballpark. And it's a bigger target to hit, but the target is still interpreted as the correct 3D scene. And finally, I'll leave off at these most challenging examples where we have fluid and cloth and jello, where on the bottom here, I'm actually showing you the full per pixel particle assignments. So in summary, GenMatter is a human-like vision system that sees moving matter. It's a hierarchical model that groups motion and appearance features into coherently moving physical entities made out of particles. It only works because of GenJAC's GPU acceleration. So we use hardware-accelerated probabilistic inference to be able to do this in real time and on a single low-power L4 GPU. So all of these experiments so far have been done on this 70 watt-ish low-performance GPU, but if we could totally just scale this up to more performant hardware. And more importantly, this is a unified modeling framework, so it handles both difficult psychophysics stimuli and real-world RGB video. And with that, I'd like to thank the members of the Classical Perceptual Intelligence team, without whom this would not be possible.
So Kartik Chandra is going to set up in the last talk of this morning session. Any questions for our presenters here? Yeah. We threw a lot of things at you. Asking generalized outside distribution. I encourage you to talk with them during the break or find us through the various links.
Are you saving questions for the end?
Oh, yeah, we'll have time at the end also. But,
Maybe I'll save.
okay, good. Save it. Yeah.
But the one thing that you might have done is include the names of your students in the program and also make those slides available.
We will do all of that. Good. I think their names are on the online one, is that right? Yeah. Okay. They should be on the online website. So hopefully they're okay. Thanks so much. Okay. So last we have Kartik Chandra. There's two Kartiks. We'll have different Kartik in the afternoon.
Two Kartik.
And what?
Oh, sorry, that was surprising to me.
It's only one Kartik here. Two screens, but one. Okay. And I'll just turn it over to him.
Right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm the first Kartik of the day. And I'll talk about Memo, domain-specific probabilistic programming language that we've been building here for doing theory of mind reasoning. I wanted to start this talk by playing a game that's called the Lewis one-word reference game. And here's how the game works. You're sitting at a table, and on this table there's three things. There's a pink circle, a green circle, and a green square. And sitting across from you at this table is your partner in this game. So it's a collaborative game. You're playing together. And your partner is randomly assigned one of these three objects to communicate to you. But what makes this game interesting and possibly even fun is that your partner is only allowed to pick one of four words. Your partner could only say round, green, square, or pink. Okay, so suppose your partner says, can you please bring me the square one? Can you all just point for me which object would you pick? Yeah, okay, good. Strong preference for the green square because it's the only object that's a square. It's the only thing that's consistent with the word square. Okay, similarly, if your partner says, can you please bring me the pink one? Again, can you guys point for me? Yeah, good. Strong preference for the pink circle because, again, it's the only pink object. It's the only thing that's consistent with the utterance pink. But now suppose that your partner says, can you please bring me the green one? This one's harder because there's two green objects, the green circle and the green square. So what are you supposed to do? But perhaps surprisingly, people generally have a preference among these two green objects, and the preference is for the green circle over the green square. And this is a real, robust, replicable effect in cognitive science. Here's some data from a replication by Ching and Franca in 2015, where they found that about twice as many people picked the green circle over the green square. Okay, so what might be going on here? What is breaking the symmetry between these two green objects? Well, let's try to analyze this game the way you would analyze any game by thinking about the strategies of the player. Okay, so suppose I'm the listener in this game, and I hear the word green. As we just discussed, if I'm just thinking literally at the level of the rules of the game, there are two green objects, and I don't really know which one to pick. But when we think about games and when we think about strategies, we don't just think literally at the level of the rules of the game. We think strategically about how other people in the game might also be thinking. This is actually true for games and also for real life, which we'll get to in a moment. But for now, in this game, I might not just be thinking about the rules, I might also be thinking about how my partner might be thinking. Okay, so my partner, the speaker in this game, what might she be thinking? Well, suppose she's trying to communicate to me the green circle. What could she do? Well, she could say green, which would be true but ambiguous. Or she could say round, which is also true but also ambiguous. So in some sense, my partner also has the same problem I do, which is stuck between two ambiguous options. But again, my partner might also not be thinking directly at the level of the literal rules of the game, but strategically about how other people like me in this game might be thinking. So now think about how my partner might be thinking about my thinking. Well, now an interesting thing happens, because my partner could say, okay, well, Kartik knows that if I were trying to communicate the green square, then I would say square because it's completely unambiguous. When I said square, you all pointed to the green square. I would never say green, this like risky, ambiguous utterance, if I were trying to communicate the green square. So Kartik should be able to figure out that if I said green, I don't mean the green square, because again, I would have just said square, and Kartik should therefore be able to work out that I actually meant the green circle, not the green square. Does that reasoning check out for everyone? Yeah? All right, thank you for nodding. This way of reasoning about how words in everyday language tend to get their meanings is called the rational speech acts framework. And it's been very, very influential in linguistics and cognitive science. And one of the reasons for that is that if you were to write out the math for how perfectly rational agents should play this game, what you would find is that the predictions made by the math predict people's behavior in experiments really, really well. So what I'm showing you here is one of these plots, just like the many, many plots Josh showed in his part of this talk, where on the x-axis are model predictions, so like what the math says a rational agent should do, and on the y-axis are what actual people in experiments do, and you see this like beautifully tight correlation that suggests that maybe this way of thinking about language really does have something correct about it. But as you might have guessed, this motif of thinking about how people think about other people is, it's not just a theme in the study of linguistics. It actually appears in lots and lots of different domains where people study how the mind works. So this kind of recursive reasoning appears in the study of how we cooperate with other people, which in turn has had applications in human-robot interaction. It appears in moral psychology and the study of institutions and leadership, in the study of psychiatry and how our social reasoning might go wrong, in the study of emotions and pedagogy and teaching and education, and it appears in economics to study how large groups of people reason about each other. In fact, the general principle of having people reason rationally about other rational people is this like really powerful, important probabilistic modeling paradigm. It's a paradigm that I think, like, if you were to condense it into three themes, it would be decision theory. So this is related to that fundamental equation of AI that Josh flashed on one of his slides, the idea that people act rationally to maximize their expected utility. The theme of Bayesian inference, which is just that we update our beliefs rationally based on our uncertainty about the world, and recursive reasoning, the idea that we think about other agents who themselves are rational with respect to these first two themes. And if you're curious about how this paradigm has kind of been cashed out in all of these different ways in the study of social cognition, I recommend this recent review by Fiery Cushman. Okay, so in my PhD, I've thought a lot about these kinds of problems, and I've built a lot of these kinds of models, often collaborating with lots and lots of researchers coming from lots of disciplinary traditions. And over the years, I kind of developed this impression that these models are really powerful and really good and really useful, and also extremely difficult to write. I think, over the course of many years of writing these models, I found that it would take, as Josh said in his talk, like on the order of one grad student year to produce one of these models. And then on top of that, it would take many days, if not like many weeks, to run the model or fit it to data. And I wanted to take a second to reflect on what actually makes it hard to write these models. I think, on reflection, what makes it hard to write these models is actually what makes it hard to write any program at all, which is that it's hard to make sure that your program is correct, and it's hard to make sure that your program runs fast. So, okay, let me explain what I mean by that. The problem with correctness with these models, as I see it, is the following. That when we think about other people's thinking, we intuitively marshal this very powerful vocabulary of words. If you were sitting at a bar and telling your friend about something that happened involving other people, you would use words like believe, think, see, do, know, want, imagine. But when it comes down to programming a model, using a programming language, the words you get access to are words like if and else and while, or if you're lucky and you know about probabilistic programming, then words like sample and infer and condition. And so as a programmer, as a grad student, or as a cognitive scientist whose job is to write this kind of model, you're constantly doing this translation in your head between believe, think, see, do, know, want, imagine, and sample, infer, condition. And who knows if the semantics are preserved? And if they're not, you end up with this whole class of really subtle, hard-to-catch bugs. Bugs like accidentally having one agent have mind control over another agent because of some leakage of information in your code that you didn't anticipate or intend. So that, to me, is the problem with correctness. The problem with efficiency is that when we think about other people's thinking, there's this natural combinatorial explosion of possible states of the world we have to reason about, not just possible states of the actual world, which is traditionally what probabilistic programming has had to contend with, but also possible states of the world imagined by possible imaginary agents who you might possibly be imagining. You can quickly see how this gets out of hand, and there's just a very large number of possible world states you have to think about. And the result of this, as I mentioned, is that it often takes on the order of many days to run your model or fit it to data. And, I don't want to be dramatic or anything, but I kind of think that this is actually a fundamental roadblock to the progress of science in all of the disciplines that I talked about earlier, because if you're a grad student and it takes you like 5 days to test whether your model works, you think about science in a completely different way than if it takes, let's say, a minute or a second or even a millisecond to test if your model works. Okay, so this was the situation with building these recursive reasoning models as of about a couple of years ago, when I went to this conference, the annual meeting for the Society for Philosophy and Psychology, and I had lunch with a whole bunch of researchers who are experts at building these kinds of models. It's a large part of their life's work. They're really, really good at it. They do it all the time. And at this lunch, we kind of discussed how hard it is to write these models. We kind of vented about it for a while, and then in like a radically solution-oriented move, we said, well, maybe we should try to fix this situation a little bit. And what we decided was that we should come up with new tools for building these models. And I decided that the right kind of tool we need is a new programming language, one that's specialized for building these kinds of recursive reasoning models. And that thought over time led to this programming language called Memo. Memo is a domain-specific programming language that's specialized for building these recursive reasoning models. So it's designed specifically to build these kinds of models. And here's what Memo does for you. It does two things. The first one is that it lets you program directly using words like believe, think, see, do, know, want, imagine. Traditionally, probabilistic programming languages are architected around the idea of sampling random variables and conditioning distributions. But in Memo, you have agents who stochastically make choices and then observe other agents' choices. And because you talk in this intuitive vocabulary of believe, think, see, do, know, want, imagine, your models are shorter, there are fewer lines of code, and you're confident that certain kinds of bugs just aren't there at all. Like, you can't have bugs like mind control. The second thing Memo does for you is it runs your models really fast. So one of the observations Memo makes is that almost by the very definition of possibilities, two possible worlds can be computed over in parallel. And so Memo compiles your model to a parallel array program in JAX, just like GenJAX, that can run really fast on a GPU. Okay, so let me show you what Memo actually looks like. You guys remember this game we played like 3 minutes ago? Great. I'm gonna build you a Memo model of the kind of reasoning we just talked through in words. Okay, so how do we do this? Well, Memo lives inside Python, and so if you know how to program in Python, you already know how to program in Memo. The first thing you do when you write a Memo model is you just set up the rules of the game. So here, for example, we say there's 3 objects on the table. Let's borrow some jargon from linguistics and call those reference. There's also these 4 things that your partner could say, green, pink, square, and round. Let's call those utterances. And then, okay, someone needs to at some point write down which utterances correspond to which reference, right? You need to say that, well, green corresponds to the green square and the green circle, but pink does not correspond to either of those. It only corresponds to the pink circle. So I'm sure all of you can sit down and write this little function denotes that's true if some utterance U describes some utterance, some referent R. Okay, once we've set up the rules of the game, then we can start building a model of the strategy. So I said earlier that Memo compiles to an array program. What did I mean by that? Well, the kinds of arrays I'm interested in are just like the data table from Ching and Franke that I showed you a few slides ago. So we want, in the end, to generate a table of predictions about what people will do in this experiment. And this table has two axes. One axis is indexed by the reference, so the objects on the table that someone could be trying to communicate, and the other axis of the table is indexed by utterances, so the things that the listener might hear. And so the very first thing we do in Memo is we say, well, we want to generate a table with these two axes, an axis for utterances and an axis for reference. Okay, what's next? Well, okay, remember how I described this model to you? I said, you know, in the end, there's a listener, and the listener thinks there's a speaker, and the speaker is given one of these reference to communicate, and then the speaker chooses an utterance with which to communicate it. And here's how you write that in Memo. You say there's a listener, and the listener thinks there's a speaker, and the speaker is given one of these references to communicate, and then the speaker chooses an utterance with which to communicate it. In Memo, you write this model just like how you would describe this game to like a friend at the bar. And once you've set that up, all you have to do is say, well, okay, the listener observes what the speaker says, and finally the listener guesses what the referent is, or the listener places a bet. And that's it. That's actually the entire model. And if I run this model, as promised, you get out an array that's indexed by reference, the objects, and utterances, the words. And okay, I mean, how do we read this table? Well, one way to read it is to say, okay, look at so look at the third row. The third row says that if the listener hears the word square, then they're 100% likely to pick the green square, which is true. That's what happened in the very first question I asked you. I said square, and you all pointed to the green square. Okay, and let's read another row. So the first row of this table says that if the listener hears the word green, then they should be 50-50 split between the green square and the green circle. That's the prediction made by this model. Okay, if you've been following along so far, you might now be a little bit concerned because that's not quite right? Like this whole thing started because there was this empirical observation that real people in the real world have a preference for the green circle over the green square. So something must be missing from our model. Does anyone have a guess about what's missing from the model? All right, you're gonna have to be louder. Unambiguous choice? What do you mean by that?
Like when we had the options, we said, well, the partner is going to use green to describe, you know, the circle because it's an unambiguous choice.
Yeah, okay, good. So I'm gonna generalize what you said a little bit. Like what's missing is that we're not reasoning about the partner at all, right? Like in this model, I mean, just look at the picture. I have a picture of the listener who's thinking about the speaker, but the speaker is just very naively just choosing an utterance at random. What we're missing is recursive reasoning about what the speaker in this model is doing. Okay, and now you might start to be like a little bit concerned, right? Because what's going to happen? Is Kartik going to like say listener thinks, speaker thinks, listener thinks, speaker thinks, listener thinks, right? Like you can imagine this getting kind of hairy and out of hand. But actually, here's the nice thing. In Memo, you only need to make two really small surgical changes to this model to make it fully recursive in this actually really sophisticated and complicated way. So I'm going to make the changes, and here they come. Blink and you'll miss it. Here they are. Change number one, recursion. So now the speaker recursively refers back to this model L that we've written of the listener. And okay, fine. So if you do recursion, you always have to have this parameter that you thread through to make sure it keeps getting smaller and you don't like bottom out or whatever. So fine, we introduce this new parameter that controls the number of levels of recursion. The other change you have to make is rationality. So now, just as you were saying, the speaker isn't naively choosing uniformly at random among the true things that they could say. Rather, the speaker is choosing with respect to some utility function, the utility being the probability that the listener guesses the right thing. if the jargon phrase softmax rational means anything to you, here the speaker is choosing with a softmax distribution over this utility. And okay, now for real, that really is it. That is the full model. And if we run this model, we do get this preference for the green circle over the green square as we predicted. And okay, you might say, Kartik, you described this really simple game to me, and then you wrote this really simple model, and what am I supposed to take away from that? Well, let me compare for you the memo implementation to how you might write this model before memo. So I actually did some archival research and found the original code that was used to implement this model in the original paper that described the rational speech acts framework. I discovered that it was implemented in R, which is this general purpose programming language. It's not a probabilistic programming language. And I looked through it, and I had a couple of reflections. Reflection 1, it was really long. It was like over 300 lines of code, whereas the memo version is fewer than 10 lines of code. It was really, really gnarly code. There were a lot of these arrays being passed around, and there were lots of tricky array manipulations happening. And it's actually really impressive that someone could write this very large piece of code and make sure all of it is really correct. But it seemed like a lot of work. It's also like very there's a high risk of having all kinds of bugs at all sorts of levels of sophistication. For example, if somewhere you forget to normalize a probability distribution, then your model might make wrong predictions, and you would never know. How would you possibly track down that issue? Okay, so some time passed, and people realized that maybe R is not the best language in which to write these models, and instead, perhaps probabilistic programming languages are better because at least they can take care of the probability math for you. So I continued spelunking and found another implementation. This is in a programming language called WebPeople, which is this general purpose probabilistic programming language that lots and lots of people have used. I actually took this code verbatim from a textbook on computational linguistics, which is actually a beautiful textbook, and I recommend it. Okay, let me say a couple of things about this code, though. Firstly, I think there's something kind of confusing about this code, which is that it uses words in ways that are unintuitive. So for example, look at the speaker model, right? It says var speaker equals, so we're talking about the speaker, and then the next thing it says is infer. But what the speaker is doing is not inferring. The speaker's making a choice. And then the next thing it says is, well, the speaker makes a uniform draw over utterances. But, okay, I don't really know what the speaker is doing, but whatever the speaker is doing, it's not a uniform draw over utterances. And so, there's a good reason why this model is written this way, but I think that the primitives of infer and uniform draw just aren't the right primitives for reasoning about agents who are behaving rationally. I'll also say that, without saying any numbers, this model is pretty slow to run and really slow to fit parameters on, and it doesn't really integrate with the existing workflows of scientists. In fact, typically to run a model in WebPeople, you would fire up your web browser and go to a website and copy and paste your model into that, and that's just kind of inconvenient for a bunch of reasons. But in comparison, the situation with Memo is, firstly, I think this code matches our intuitive description. It uses words like believe, think, see, do, know, want, imagine. And if you make a mistake, it'll give you an error message in the language of agents. It'll say something like, Alice can't do this computation because she doesn't know this thing that Bob chose, and so there's no way she could do that. I often get emails from users who say, these error messages used to be annoying, but actually they help me a lot with fostering conceptual clarity. They help me understand why my model is wrong at this really fundamental level, not just why my code is wrong, but why maybe I need to think differently about this setting altogether. Okay, Memo is about 10 times faster than the WebPeople version on the same CPU, though if you own a GPU, you can just plug it in and immediately it'll run on the GPU. It's end-to-end differentiable, so if you wanted to optimize any of these parameters by gradient descent, you could do that. And because it lives in the Python ecosystem, you can immediately start making plots with your favorite scientific Python tools. And by the way, because it's both fast and compatible with all of these tools, you can do kind of cool things like build these interactive plots where, so here, each time that slider moves, it's live recomputing the model and making a graph. And these kinds of visualizations are just so valuable to get like an intuitive sense of what your model is doing. And the last thing I'll say is that because it's part of the JAX ecosystem, it integrates with all kinds of powerful tools like deep learning and physics simulation. I won't talk about examples of those, but if you're curious, ask me afterwards and I can show you. Okay, so this was just one demo, but let me now start like broadening out and give you examples of Memo in practice. The first thing I'll say is we've built lots and lots of Memo models now of lots of classic scenarios or problems across lots of disciplines that are concerned with recursive reasoning, and in almost every case, the Memo version is between 10 and like millions of times faster. And in every case, you have to write a lot less code in Memo than in the best implementation we could find on GitHub. So, okay, if you're in the know about these things, there's this formalism called an MDP, a Markov decision process. And it's kind of a hazing ritual for undergrads to have to implement an MDP solver in some AI class. In Memo, you can write one in about 10 lines of code. There's a more advanced version of an MDP called a POMDP, which is this like famously hairy thing to program. And in Memo, you can write it in about 15 lines of code. And more than that, you can start composing them. You can say, okay, Kartik thinks that Josh is someone in a POMDP. So, okay, you remember this example of the hungry grad student in the food truck that Josh talked about maybe about an hour ago? Let me refresh your memory. So there's this hungry grad student who starts off on the bottom of this plot, and they're out looking for food, and there's these two food trucks, the Korean truck labeled K and the Lebanese truck labeled L. And the grad student walks around the wall, sees the Lebanese food, rejects it, goes back around and eats at the Korean food truck. And you all, when asked, said, what is this grad student's favorite type of food? Well, it's actually neither of these. It's probably Mexican food. The grad student was looking for something and didn't find it. So what Josh might not have mentioned is that it took Chris Baker on the order of a year and hundreds of lines of code to implement this model, and it took many days for it to run. In Memo, it's on the order of maybe less than 100 lines of code. Josh and I like pair programmed it over the course of maybe a day. And it runs on the order of like 5 seconds, and it recovers all of these really sophisticated inferences. So the plot on top is showing you that, up until the point where he goes around the wall, he's not sure, but then as soon as he can see, he sees that it's Lebanese food. The plot on the bottom is recovering this really sophisticated structure of, well, okay, so you start going around the wall and it's not clear what this grad student wants, but once they turn around, suddenly it becomes clear that they didn't find what they were looking for, so they must have been looking for the Mexican food that isn't even there on the screen, and finally they go back to the Korean food truck, so they perhaps have a preference for Korean over Lebanese. Okay, continuing expanding outward to ever larger and more interesting cases, I wanted to talk to you about one application of Memo that I'm particularly excited about, which is using Memo to study problems or challenges in mental health. So sometime in September, I was reading this New York Times article about this problem of AI psychosis, or this kind of really fascinating phenomenon where people have these long extended conversations with ChatGPT, and even though they didn't have any pre-existing mental health conditions diagnosed, they very quickly end up having these really strong beliefs about strange things, like that they're being spied on by the government, or that they've made some like fundamental physics discovery or something like that. Has anyone else heard of this phenomenon, by the way? I'm just curious. Yeah, okay, cool. So why might this be happening? Well, one of the theories that people have been tossing around is that what's going on is that someone might say, I have a suspicion that maybe, I'm not sure about this, but it might be the case that vaccines aren't safe. And ChatGPT, in the way that it's trained to always please its users, will say, you're absolutely right. Here's a bunch of evidence supporting your view. And because it always wants to please and validate you, it can cause this feedback loop that strengthens an aberrant belief. Here's Senator Amy Klobuchar expressing this more eloquently. She says, one of the things that we know about these AI chatbots is that they're frequently designed to tell users what they want to hear, which leads them to go down this kind of rabbit hole. This is from a congressional hearing on this problem that happened in September. So I was thinking about this, and I thought this is the kind of thing that we could possibly study with Memo. So I built this formal framework for thinking about how a user who is rational might reason about a conversation they're having with a chatbot that is sycophantic in the language of AI. So it's always trying to suck up to you. It's always trying to validate you. And I built this memo model and I ran simulations, and you can see from these simulations that, so here each line is one simulated conversation, and the y-axis is belief in some hypothesis. So users might start off unsure about something, but the model very quickly polarizes their belief, either to be very confident that it's true or very confident that it's false. And we can then simulate, well, how about what happens if we modulate the degree of sycophancy or the presence of it? And we find that, well, if you increase sycophancy, this happens more and more. And if you take it out, it happens less and less. We can also think about, well, what are some possible solutions to this problem? So one possible solution to this problem might be, what if we somehow constrain models to never be able to make stuff up? What if they are constrained to always tell the truth? Another type of intervention might be, what if we tell people that ChatGPT can be sycophantic, and maybe if people are informed about this possibility, then they will be somehow immune or invulnerable to this problem. And we can actually write memo models of all of these things and find that actually they help a little bit, but they don't solve the problem completely. Okay, so all of these are kind of initial explorations, but what I really wanted to point out is all of this exploring took about 100 lines of code because delusional spiraling or AI psychosis is a rare phenomenon. You have to run lots and lots of simulations to get statistically significant results. But with Memo, you can run about 10 million simulations in 4-ish minutes. Okay, but it's not just me. Lots of people in the world at lots of institutions have been using Memo. Several research papers have been published with Memo models, and Memo has kind of surprisingly but delightfully been adopted as a teaching tool, and it's being used in lots of courses, textbooks, and summer schools. I wanted to end, however, by saying one kind of big picture thing about Memo and programming languages more broadly that I've been really excited about. As a programming languages researcher, I kind of think of myself as being in the business of designing tools, but sometimes it's the case that a tool becomes this valuable scientific metaphor. So for example, a thermostat is a tool for regulating indoor temperature, but a thermostat is also this powerful metaphor for homeostasis in biological systems. And recently, I've been thinking about Memo as a kind of metaphor for our theories of mind writ large. And in a series of projects and papers, we've been thinking about how ideas and metaphors from the theory of programming languages can help us better understand the structure and development of how people reason about other people. And if you're curious what I could possibly mean by that, then please ask me afterwards. Okay, that's all I've got. Thank you.
So now, ask questions, and again, for any of the speakers about
Yeah, you guys want to say?
In listening to your talk, I began thinking of a slight generalization of Memo that would make it much more interesting, where you have multiple listeners and speakers and want to note how they differ in their impression, to get a consensus, but much more interestingly, to find prejudices and inaccuracies. For example, if one of the listeners was Fred, and he gave a completely random classification of red, blue versus green, this might be an indication that he's colorblind. And in addition to that, if you generalize this to more interesting problems, like recognizing a pedestrian crossing the street and distinguishing that from noise, and your listeners and speakers were, let's say, Waymo navigation algorithms, and you wanted to see which were better or more accurate at doing that, that would be a really interesting set of applications for this.
You want to take that?
Sure, yeah, thank you. No, I think you're absolutely right. I think one of the interesting things about building a programming language that's in the JAX ecosystem is that you can start connecting it in this modular way to other pieces that other people have built. So, for example, your suggestion of comparing one type of model that's maybe more like a Waymo car against a different type of model that's maybe doing a more probabilistic inverse graphics type of approach on some kind of social reasoning task where you're like, say, making sense of why someone might be like running into the road. Oh, it's because like there's this child and they're trying to rescue the child, right? Like that kind of social reasoning. Well, I think that the way to architect this system, both kind of coming from my training as a computer scientist who has like engineered systems, but also from what I know about cognitive architectures and what we know about how knowledge is organized in the brain, is that the way to build this kind of system is to have a specialized system that does this kind of theory of mind reasoning, something maybe like Memo, and be able to connect it through interfaces and APIs to other systems like systems for vision. Where's Eric? I was trying to gesture to him. Systems for vision or systems for physical reasoning in this like really powerful way that lets you do reasoning that's like greater than the sum of its parts. So I think like all of that is like really cool and interesting and on the right track.
Yeah, I mean, I think JAX already has like driving simulators in it, or at least you could implement little physical car scenarios where the cars have different memo models. Or the first thing you said, I think it's also interesting, but I think Memo would support that actually, right? Like, again, part of having a good programming language is you could write these multi-agent, Kartik showed two agents, but you could have more than two people who have different models of perception and different models of each other's perception, where you might think, oh yeah, wait, are you colorblind or something? Oh, I see. So anyway, I think it's really cool, and you should try it out. You could try it out even right now. So it's very, very easy to use. Okay. Any other questions? Thank you. Yeah. No. Okay. Well, we're a little over time, but I'll just to expand on. I mean, I really appreciate the question. And one way to say what we're trying to get at with these kind of models, and especially what happens when you can integrate them with, like if you're the sort of person who likes vibe coding, or as I like to say, prop coding, like the way I as a professor code. Kartik was very kind when he said, we're generous, when he said, oh, the two of us pair program that. No, that is not true. I suggested you do it, and mostly Kartik programmed it. So whether you're acting like a prof or more like a grad student, engaging a little bit more with the code, I think the goal of a lot of this kind of research is like code at the speed of thought. If you have a thought and you can express it in your mind, like you want to be able to write the code like as if you could think about it at the speed and expressiveness of your thinking, and then have it run and test it out and debug it like a thinking process. That's both an aspiration for good programming tools, but going back to what I was talking about and the broad theme here, that's how we think about the mind. Because what is thought? What is going on in thinking at the speed of thought? The idea that it's actually not just running code, but writing code and flexibly exploring code that you use to think about the world in all these flexible ways. That's really that's I'd say as a computational cognitivist, that's my North Star. And I'm, again, just thrilled to be working with the Quest and these great students who are helping to deliver that in a way that I could have really never dreamed possible even just a few years ago. So thank you. Awesome. Thank you guys also, and have a nice lunch break. And we'll stay around for a bit.